Final Fantasy XIV's stats, in particular the properties like critical hit and determination, have never really been very interesting or exciting. Now, depending on the player, this can both be a huge problem or actually pretty nice. So let's talk about that. The gold standard of critical hit, then determination and direct hit, sometimes including speed, skill or spell speed, is something that is really decided by what is mathematically the most effective. And once you look into how the various stats scale, it is relatively obvious why this stat parity comes about. Direct hit and determination scales linearly and reliably. They also scale faster than tenacity in the case of tanks, at least in terms of raw damage output and healing output. Piety doesn't make you do more damage or healing, and speed doesn't affect most of your cooldowns. Critical hit scales slightly slower, but affects both chance and power, meaning that the more you have of it, the better it gets, and it eventually overtakes all of the other stats and power point for point. I have various videos that explain each of these stats in more detail in the description if you want the longer versions. However, because of the rigid design of each job, most of them don't really appreciate speed that much, and on the other hand, due to the amount of stuff that isn't affected by speed, simply making the attacks do more damage when they are available makes crit, determination, and direct hit more valuable, without much competition. This further emphasizes the blandness of these three stats that, while sure, when you use your big attack and make the big damage number it make brain go happy chemicals, the rotation is largely exactly the same whether you just reach level 100 or if you have the full best in slot set. The only thing that changes is the damage numbers. The only job where this isn't entirely the case is Monk, wherein critical hits generate chakra, meaning the better your gear gets, the more chakra you can expect to generate. But indeed, when the three best stats overall each don't really do anything for how you play the game, it means the only real way your rotation is going to change throughout an expansion is if a major patch changes something, or if some sort of odd discovery means you have to play differently to play optimally, assuming you care about that. Meanwhile, the three stats that have more meaningful effects don't make the damage numbers go up as well as the three kings, but each does something that, at least in my opinion, is more interesting. Piety makes you have more MP to work with, which, when you actually can use it, can massively rearrange your options. Now, you rarely ever need that though. While tenacity is only about 80% as effective as determination at increasing damage and healing, it reduces damage taken extremely well. The problem of course being that all duties are designed to be beatable without the help of tenacity, which means that you could argue that quote-unquote needing tenacity is a skill issue. Whether that skill issue is yours or someone else's. And finally, speed. Regardless of whether it is skill or spell speed, is by far the most impactful stat of them all in terms of playing experience. It actively rearranges how your rotation plays out, both by making your weapon skills and spells come out faster, making the rotation itself play faster, but also because various cooldowns are not affected by speed, means that exactly where in your GCD your OGCDs come out varies depending on your speed stats. However, as it turns out, over the years, jobs have gotten so many cooldowns that are not affected by speed that it either doesn't matter, or jobs outright hate speed as a result. Some jobs also straight up have GCDs that aren't affected by speed, making it even more awkward to play if you do have speed. Sage's Euphrasia, Machinist's Hypercharge, Dancer's Steps, Reaper's Reaps, Pictomancer's Motifs, yes really, come to mind. Another factor is also that many jobs' primary benefit from speed is that, in addition to getting more GCDs, means that they generate more resources, but many of the jobs where this is the case already generate plenty without speed, and thanks to the 2-minute burst, you'd essentially need a ludicrous amount of speed to generate an additional use of these resources, making it usually pretty much unattainable anyway. Now, despite these fun stats having this incredible detriment of the other stats make damage number bigger better. Each of them has ways to do some very interesting things. For instance, stacking tenacity hard enough could lead you to taking 20% less damage all the time, which might allow you to get away with things you normally wouldn't. And in fairness, the damage lost from choosing tenacity isn't that much, but it is made out to be a lot more because the damage reduction from tenacity rarely helps more than the damage output lost would by possibly skipping a mechanic. Yes, really. But in older content where the damage loss is much less impactful anyway, the damage reduction could make up for a less effective group overall, like how I discussed in my Mentor Carry build video a while back. Piety, in a similar fashion, has the capacity to cover over others' mistakes way more by having way more MP, allowing more races and more spell healing if it's actually necessary somehow. And some jobs have perfectly viable high-speed builds, and other jobs, even if they don't, may scale well enough with speed that, say, a high-speed Viper could lead to some unique variety and capacity in its rotation, at a relatively manageable loss. Things like that. Now, we can talk all day about how tenacity could be more useful if tanks were taking enough more damage that it was necessary, but how much is enough, and if you make encounters do so much damage that tenacity is needed, then it isn't an interesting choice anymore, and just becomes mandatory. Doesn't solve the problem. Piety could be made more useful if healers needed more MP to make it through fights by default, like if they had way less OGCD options to heal with, or if they cost MP and whatnot. But that would simply mean that healers would not work very well without Piety. And again, it wouldn't open up new options, but rather lock you down so you need a certain amount of Piety. Doesn't solve the problem. And for speed, a general suggestion, which I do agree with, is why is it skill and spell speed are separate stats? If they were one combined stat, certain job that don't want the stat might at least not hate it as much anymore. Yes, I intentionally said certain job, singular, paladin. And even so, they might not actually care more about speed. They just wouldn't dislike it as much. Similarly, if critical hit was adjusted to no longer be such an overachieving king of stats, we would simply replace one king with another. If crit isn't the king, then determination and direct hit will share the throne instead. There's also the argument that, broadly speaking, the combination of critical hit, determination and direct hit in a best-in-slot set adds up to, on average, somewhere between 30 and 40, maybe even 50% more damage than if you just didn't have all those stats. Which is to say, if you replaced one of them with tenacity, you'd still be close to that damage output. If you replaced one of them with piety, you would do significantly less damage, of course. And if you replaced one of them with speed, well, to be perfectly honest with you, the way speed changes your rotation makes it somewhat impossible for me to determine how much it would affect your damage precisely. However, arguably, it would be a lot more impactful than piety, for instance. Which is my rather long-winded way of saying, even though there is a significant and tangible power difference between the best and the worst stats, what seems to matter more is often how much damage you can cram into raid buffs, meaning those previously mentioned 30 to 50% more damage, which admittedly is slightly exaggerated, if not heavily exaggerated, is multiplied further by raid buffs, if any. But for most more casual, less optimized content, it really does not matter that much. But because of the relative simplicity of the best stats, despite the low difference between the stats, there is still a clear winner. Critical hit, of course. So, if the stats are close enough that it doesn't matter that much, how is it possible that there is such a clear hierarchy in the stats? And why is it matters so much? Simply put, there will always be an optimal choice. We've talked about this just on this channel many times before. Which leads me to another important point. Back in Endwalker, I brought up this subject of stats being boring too, and back then I suggested it would be way cooler if each stat was way more impactful and if we didn't have super similar stats like both crit and direct hit, crit and diet crit. The argument being that if all the stats were more impactful, different jobs would presumably want different stat priorities, and every stat might actually do more. For instance, if more jobs had interactions with crits like Monk does, then the jobs that want crit would feel more impactful and interesting as you accumulated more crit. Jobs that appreciate speed would, of course, go faster and faster as you accumulated more speed. In fact, having all the stats be super impactful could also mean you have multiple builds to choose from. Some jobs actually have this today, like Samurai and Gunbreaker, except all of them still have a best build despite the options. Yes, the power difference is small enough that you can choose whichever you prefer, but there is always a best choice, of course. However, to pick apart each of those arguments, more impactful stats means more build options, and more impactful stats mean you can feel your better gear. Let's start with the first one. Who actually cares about stat builds? Out of all the players of Final Fantasy XIV, a very, very small selection of players sit down and calculate the nitty-gritty of each stat and figure out what is optimal. A slightly larger selection of players might estimate these things for themselves so they understand why the priorities are the way they are, but ultimately rely on those initial optimizers. A much larger selection of players then simply copy the optimal strategy, whether that's following a stat priority or just collecting the best in slot sets directly. A step beyond that, we have the selection of players that think it is funny to stack a particular stat and simply will for the fun of it. The kind of player that will mega stack speed on a job that really doesn't want it because they think it is fun, but the content they play either doesn't care or they play in groups where they don't mind. As in, they're all on the same page, and are all alright with sillier builds, or at least don't mind it. And then there's the rest of the player base that doesn't really care about stats at all. They just want to have quote-unquote good equipment. If even that. They just want to be able to play the game. In other words, making stats more impactful so that you have more choices and options and more builds to make, or that the optimal choice is more difficult to determine, is interesting for a very small selection of players, and for a much larger selection of players, it would ultimately just leave the door open to choose even more wrong, and the wrong choice would hurt more. So, do we really need more build options? Would it really be better? For the other argument, more impactful stats means you can feel your better gear. In a way, certain jobs used to have this. Bard is a good example of this. Back in the day, the way repertoire worked was that it activated whenever your dots critically ticked, which meant just as you reached max level and your gear sorta sucked, you would get way less procs. Then, as you got better gear throughout the expansion, things got better and better, but then, if a new expansion released, you'd effectively reset back down to Sucktown. Essentially, this kind of design would mean that a lot of jobs would ultimately feel like a ghost of their full capacity until the final rate tier of an expansion. And the more casual players that simply cannot collect the best in slot sets would just be locked out entirely from experiencing this level of the job. On the one hand, we could argue this would motivate more casual players to try harder content. On the other hand, a significant selling point of Final Fantasy XIV is the fact you don't have to do the hard content. You can enjoy the specific content you enjoy, and that's alright. So, to wrap up on this discussion a bit, making all the stats way more impactful because that would be entertaining, it certainly would be, but it might really not be necessary. Even if making the stats more impactful could lead to more builds, optimization essentially dictates that even with various build options, there will always be a best choice, and if stats are more impactful, then the wrong choice is proportionally worse, so by letting the stats stay about as impactful as they are now, choosing wrong is less crucial. What I feel really could help Final Fantasy XIV's stats as a whole without completely uprooting the existing situation is the following. 1. Skill and spell speed should really just be one stat. It matters for very, very few jobs, and for the rest, just is additional clutter for no reason. It would of course also be nice if jobs were designed to hate speed a bit less. 2. It would be nice if Piety also did something more, whether it just has a similar effect to Tenacity, where it boosts damage and healing, but by less than Determination, or if it is something more imaginative, doesn't matter to me, but it would certainly help. For the rest, ultimately, Tenacity is alright already, and there's nothing that can be done for Tenacity that doesn't just invalidate a different stat. The reason Determination and Direct Hit are preferred over Tenacity in most optimization is because they increase damage better, and we have enough defensive cooldowns that reducing damage further is, for the most part, not needed. To make Tenacity a higher priority, it would need to actually add more damage than the alternatives, or at least as much. And at that point, Tenacity would just be Determination but better, objectively, which kind of seems to miss the point too. I know some of you might go, but if I take less damage with Tenacity, the healer can attack more. But once we reach the levels of optimization where that matters, the group as a whole is strong enough that the healers are already attacking as much as they possibly can, and the tank taking less damage isn't saving them any GZDs. Now, if your Tenacity reduced the damage the rest of the team took, we might be cooking, but it doesn't. But it would be funny. But what do you think? Are the stats excellent as they are? Do you have an idea of how to make them more interesting considering the thoughts I laid out here? Please do let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Stormblood replaced the accuracy stat with Direct Hit. Before this point, accuracy was the kind of stat that ultimately was the best stat until you had enough. As in, it would on average increase your damage the most of all stats, right up until you no longer could miss. After which point it was a useless stat, worse than the Piety we have now, as it would do nothing. These kinds of amazing up to a point stats are difficult to play with in a game with very few gear options in every raid tier.